Hey, folks, you're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hendricks. Today we have a guest. His name is Bronson, and he has a job that I have to admit, I had to look up the title because I didn't know that this job description even existed. He is a geotechnical engineer, and I'm really glad he's here to explain exactly what he does because I've never heard of that one before. Welcome, Bronson.
Tim,
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm real good.
So,
We're
So go ahead and we'll start off with a little bit of history about where you were born, your early upbringing, and walk through your education, and just kind of give us your origin story in a few minutes.
sure. Well, I'm a misplaced Midwesterner. Grew up in Greene County, Missouri, and went to Parkview High School. Uh, kind of graduated early and did a formative year, a foreign exchange student to France.
Oh wow,
And I would say, of all the education experiences, if you could boil it down into the one thing that really set me about on a trajectory, from high school age forward, is that year spent abroad.
what was it that was so transformative?
Well, it got me out of my comfort zone.
Ah,
And when you don't speak the language super well, you end up saying yes to things that you don't fully understand. And keeping an open mind, it kind of forces you to try things, and a lot of ways go out on a limb. But you know that that in of itself. Um, but I mean, I tell you, there's not a day goes by that I'm not doing something or touching something that um, wasn't that didn't have roots into those years.
wow.
So if anyone gets a chance to break out of the American high school culture, go check out a different culture anywhere else. Anything that's different, that's a strong plug.
How long were you over there for the foreign exchange stint? Was it just a year or
As
two, or?
um, through the scholastic year, but the way the visas worked out, I stayed up until the day they were going to kick me out. Uh, I the it's a it's a really long story, but the short version is I didn't have anything to do between the summer after that senior year until I started university. So I said, well, I'm not going to go back to Missouri to hang out and not have anything to do. I'm going to stay in France, hang out at the beach, be with my friends,
Hmm.
and continue traveling. So yeah, I came back 2 days before starting freshman orientation week at University of Missouri Rolla.
Wow. What's what's the reception like? You always hear about certain countries that like Americans, don't like Americans, and I'm sure it just depends on how you act. Did you have a somewhat of a cold reception until you won them over, or was it pretty warm from the very beginning, or how was your interaction with folks over there?
Man, that's a great question. Because at the time, you think back, Tim, uh, that was in the 2002, 2003 school year. And at that, like it was March of 2003 that the United States invaded Iraq.
Yeah,
And but I mean, first the host families, they all agreed to host an American, right? So you've already got like your closest people to you are already on your side, or at least an open mind.
yeah,
Um, my role, uh, one of the roles that you have is to be an ambassador for your culture, and it doesn't mean that you own the politics of your country, but in a way you represent the actions on a global stage.
yeah.
So at a right young age of 17, I was confronted at times with peers who were also curious and wanted to know my opinions, and did I agree or didn't agree. And it was one of the first times I realized how, I don't want to say forceful, but how present the United States foreign policy is,
Yeah.
um, and how engaged the young people were. Like I didn't think, I read the Economist, and I was in a speech and debate. And we had all these news sources from foreign lands. Other people in my peer group didn't read in the United States, but the vast majority of those high school students were current on the affairs of the world, and they were aware of what was happening and the direction things were going in a way that I was never on my own, and my peer group wasn't. So yeah, fascinating question. And then of course with the war, or the military action, or whatever we ended up calling it, that was a high point because I came out of like the equivalent of a Best Buy, like walked out on the street, and there was a giant anti-war protest, which France had protests, every 3 days for anything. But
That's true. Yeah.
but that was a big one at
Right.
that time, and I was really surprised by how strongly people felt. And that's what I took away from it is that there are people that care very deeply, um, and right, wrong, left or right, it's people feel very passionately, and I think it's really important to keep that open mind and learn the other point of view.
Do you think that, and this is a bit of a rabbit hole, we haven't got to your job yet, but I am curious. Do you, in the United States, you can drive 2 days in any direction and you'll still be in the United States. And then you go over to Europe and you drive 2 days and you've passed through 4 or 5 countries, depending on what part of Europe you're in.
Yeah,
I, I sometimes wonder if we just are never exposed to different cultures as often, or as they live right there, like a couple hundred miles that way or kilometers, whichever. I forget what they use
yeah.
over there, but so I think it's just more part of their daily life to mix and mingle with different cultures, and so there's a lot of cross conversations. Does that track?
It it kind of does, and I also had that same kind of, hey, the geographic boundaries, being formed of European countries were geographic features like mountains and rivers, and they were hard to cross at the but if you think about it, I mean, there are people that live in St. Louis County that have never been west of what am I thinking, 370,
Yeah.
and they've never been east of Page Avenue
Right.
or 170, right? And I had, yeah, rabbit hole, but we had, we've hosted exchange students, and those exchange students have come home and told us about their interactions with the kids. And, you know, one stands out that the student came home and told us that they met someone who had never left, who had never been outside of St. Louis City. And so, yeah, there are people in Europe that don't travel as much, and you consider the fuel costs are 3 times as high. It's just not a thing. Like we have the freedom to travel in 2 days in one
Yeah.
direction, sometimes not get out of the state.
Right.
Uh,
Thinking
but
of you, Texas.
but other times, um, you've got to have the ambition or the will to go, or there has to be an attraction to go and see, um, or a heart to go and explore. And some people are not made that way.
Sure. And it's different strokes for different folks. But you made a comment a minute ago that it's something that I personally have always just had in my head. And I've only been to a couple of countries, but I've not done a lot of extensive traveling outside of North America. But I see sometimes folks that travel over to Europe and they seem to think that they're going to have the red carpet rolled out or that the Constitution follows them.
Mm,
And those two things a lot of times are not, well, one of them is not true. When you leave here, the rules of America don't apply in other countries. So you have to remember that. But I also think that one thing that Americans have forgotten is that we need to go over wherever we're going and represent our country to the best of our ability. because if you have folks that have maybe a negative viewpoint of America, they can at least say, well, that guy wasn't that bad. He was okay. And that's how the change in perception begins.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'll get off my soapbox now and let's get back to talking about your geotechnical engineering. So you've come back from your obviously very important and transformative time in France. You have started school in Raleigh, you said,
Yes,
and walk me through those next steps in your education.
man. So, like doing the college search, uh, you know, between shucking oysters and surfing was difficult. I have my mom to thank for filling out some of the application forms. I had a free ride to a number of universities, except for where I ended up going, and it was so the University of Missouri Rolla. They've since changed their name or rebranded to Missouri Science and Technology, and I selected that school because they have their big slogan at the time was the name, the degree, the difference, and I believed, based on the stats, the research that I'd done, that the job placement and the starting salaries were my best future, like that.
Hmm.
And so I enrolled on that banner and was determined to figure out what type of engineering I was going to do, but I had to get started so I could explore. And it took it took a little while to get through the freshman prereqs, and you kind of bounce around. You go to as many seminars as you can, and you float between the big four: chemical, mechanical, electrical, and civil engineering. Everyone, a lot of if you talk about engineering, most people know those four.
Mm-hmm.
But I was influenced by a professor who was a fascinating guy, former Marine intelligence um, officer, had traveled, done all kinds of geotechnical forensics, so failures and understanding why and how failures happened. Um, it came out of the consulting world, so you know, rather than private or public works like the Army Corps of Engineers. And gosh, I just was really interested in the kinds of things that he was doing, and that led me into the geotechnical engineering world. Um, so geotechs themselves are part of the civil. If you think of those four: electrical, civil, mechanical, those are the big four. But there are branches of them. I think of those as big fours as trees, and that these branches are specializations.
Yeah.
And the geotechnical engineering course of study is a master's degree level course of study. There's so much in the fundamentals of from civil engineering that you really have to have good roots in before you can get to the level of study where geotech happens.
What was the initial uh, launching point for I'm going to get into engineering? Where was there did you have an early influence as far as a family member or a friend that did it, or was it just something that you saw, or how did you find yourself in that lane?
Man, so it was a course of things that happened, starting probably with Ben Jagger's in eighth grade shop, uh, where and through those years, seventh grade, you start taking aptitude tests, and there's a Venn diagram for everything,
Yeah.
um, and engineers love Venn diagrams the most. so when you're a problem solver and you enjoy math, and that puts you in the engineer category.
Okay.
And so I socially wasn't super strong, but I knew that was a weakness, and I just thought, okay, someone's going to put problems on my desk, and I can solve them, and I like that part. Um, and then you develop the tools, to solve the problems. And the more tools you have, if you only have one, you only have the hammer, every problem looks like the nail.
Yeah.
And so to recognize all the variable solutions, you got to have a lot of tools in your tool bag.
Is the tool collection filling up your toolbox, to continue with the analogy, is that where you have the discovery of this is my favorite kind of puzzle, and then
Yeah,
that leads you down one of those branches?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
That's it.
So
Thermodynamics or organic chemistry, like that. Those are interesting puzzles, but I was not interested in acquiring those tools as much as hey studying soil stratigraphy, rock stratigraphy, behavior of those natural materials. There's a wider range, uh, wider design envelope, and found it more fascinating. Yeah.
what industries do you typically find your skill set utilized the most? And I can see, building bridges, building
Yep.
skyscrapers. If you're in an area that's prone to earthquakes, I can see mining. But do you then work in all of those, or do you have? I'm a geotechnical engineer that specializes in earthquake zone construction, or in mining, or do you just kind of do it all?
Well, certainly early on, um, you you do everything you can
Okay.
because there are the associates or the 25-year senior folks that have spent their career becoming the expert in like deep foundations, or more specifically large diameter pipe pile foundations, that are. And so the more senior you get, the more specialized you tend to fall into, not only in the category of geotech, but of a type of foundation or of a type of construction, like a bridge or a skyscraper. But early on, you kind of dabble in everything.
The the focus that you choose, well, the focus may choose you. You may
That's
be
right.
going down a certain lane thinking I'm really digging this, and all of a sudden you, no pun intended there, and you move over and you find another lane that you really like, and you find yourself, doing something else. It seems like it's just a process of discovery. As you are learning everything, you're discovering what you're good at and what you gravitate towards.
Absolutely. and
Okay.
and there are, I'll add that there are, uh, 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 in my experience, a lot of geotechs end up in some form of consulting. and
Okay.
and what that means is it's a design firm that does the initial planning or the components of design. So that's before any ground gets broken for buildings, right? Like the initial civil planners lay out where the bridge abutments are going to go, and then the geotechs start working on, well, how deep do these foundations need to go, or what's the most economical form that will support the loads that the structurals or the bridge designers have developed. So there's a lot of design optimization that happens before the geotechs get involved. And
Do
yeah,
Well, do you find a lot of clashing between the the more artistic design, this is what we want because it looks cosmetically appealing, versus the engineer side, the structural side, where you say this is not going to work?
uh, I initially I wouldn't call that a clash. It's more of the iterative design process. Um,
Collaborative efforts
yeah.
then? Okay.
Well, in iterative meaning, hey, we start with a concept and kind of a 10% thought through idea, and you cut out the stuff that is not going to work, that is unreasonable, or you design or you adapt the design to make, to think it through a little more, maybe get it to that 35 or the 55%. Um, and then you can start really putting a form to the function of what you're going to build. If an architect, which is where the cosmetic look and feel if the design comes from them, there may be more iterations or getting the structural components, the forces to um, to support that cosmetic form. Uh, you got to get that in lined out early. When it's purpose, like municipalities or counties putting in a bridge, there's not often points awarded for beautiful bridges, but I can think of
There is
um,
not.
but a lot of pedestrian bridges, or signature bridges for cities, they tend to have a flair, or there's something that's going to be in that city's postcard, and so they want that to look and represent the feel and kind of the banner for that city. So those are really important design processes.
I got a question that's totally out of left field, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. And this is just my opinion. So anybody listening, you can keep your letters and your emails at home. But um, a lot of the time when I see something being built nowadays, I don't see a lot of imagination. I don't see, I know that you can make something just over the top artistic. But if you look at society now, a lot of times these older buildings have so much character and there's so much uniqueness. And they took the time to go, yes, I know that this costs a little bit more, but it's going to be so pleasing to the eye and make it look warm or comforting or whatever positive term you want to put on that. Nowadays, it
Yeah.
seems like it's just very much the budget was obviously in charge of this project. Is that a dance that you typically do on every project where it's we'd like to make this really look like this, but we can only afford to make it look like this, and so that's what we're going to have to settle for?
Um, Honestly, Tim, I don't run into that a whole lot. And a lot of times those decisions are made in the design process before I get to them.
Okay.
Uh, but you know, it's an interesting question because you think, like, in architecture, different cities have different feels. St. Louis is a big brick city,
Mhm.
um, and so that's all the clay mines. I mean, that was the readily available source materials.
Yeah.
And Florida is a lot of stucco, um, because that suits the climate, and it's easy to put up, you
Yeah.
know, and most of Florida has been built out in the last 50, 60 years. I mean, everything.
Yeah.
Um, and you get, older cities have more durable materials because that's all that was available. I drive by one of the oldest, longest single span concrete bridges. In the early 1900s, concrete was a new building material. We
That's
still didn't,
crazy.
yeah. And so you um, I think it's so interesting about the architecture or the feel of buildings, because what may have been just an everyday item at the time, your everyday 5-story apartment building, may be something pretty special 30, 40 years from now.
Right.
It
Yeah, you
doesn't
see that.
feel that special now.
Well, you see that in St. Louis. I've spent a fair amount of time in St. Louis, and you'll see these new skyscrapers go up, or these high-rise apartment complexes, and they're, very modern looking, lots of glass, lots of metal, lots of concrete. And then you'll see a building next to it that's, 80 years old, 90 years old, that's 4 or 5 stories. It's made from brick. And the contrast is stark. But there's a warmth that those older buildings have that a lot of times the new ones just don't. But I also know that there's the insulating factor and the durability factor and the speed of construction and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah, and economics of operations also comes into play. If it was just as economical to build that same brick building, uh, I think owners would be doing it.
sure.
The really cool stuff that's coming out with the LEED certified is all, these environmental
Hmm.
forward architectural concepts and material selections. We're doing some
Yeah.
stuff now. I say we, not me, but the market is doing some really interesting things with resins and basically paper in making sidings that are
Hmm.
more environmentally friendly and just as durable, that have an incredible an insulation factor. And you know, I think those guys laying those bricks in the 1920s would kill to have something like that. You know,
Probably, yeah.
and yeah, I think that there's still a lot of uh, you know research and development into building materials, and I think the
Sure.
architects are on the leading edge of that and bringing that into our cities and our homes. And I'm on the I'm on the soil level and down, as far as the design side. So uh, the really cool projects for me is when you can actually see what you've constructed, because it's so rare, right? And once you lay the foundation, everything's covered up, and you know, you only know if the geotech screwed up at some point, because there's cracks or something in the walls
Yeah.
or windows stop closing, and the tolerances for those are huge. So it's it's well, oftentimes if the windows aren't closing and the doors, there's cracks in the foundation. Oftentimes the geotech was not involved at all.
Oh, okay.
So
So let's dive into your specific day-to-day stuff.
uh,
What do you typically focus on as like, let's say you're coming into work this morning and besides this interview, what's something that you're going to be digging into?
uh, on a normal day.
Yeah.
So from an elevator speech, I would say we're evaluating future construction sites to determine the acceptable building loads, performing or collecting soil samples, performing laboratory tests on those soil and rock samples, and then writing. I think half of every day is writing, either
Mm.
writing technical description emails, updating your client, or working on sections of the report um, as the data comes in and as the analysis is completed.
So you're running a lot of calculations with math. You're looking at the type of soil that this project is in. You're looking at, I'm assuming you're looking at water, where it's
Yep,
flowing, underground aquifers, all that kind of stuff. That you just have a checklist of things that you have to run every project through and make sure that it's fitting those parameters of each step.
that's a really good summary. Yeah,
Okay.
and
So,
estimating the performance of those materials.
hmm,
Uh, to put another way, you know, we can measure with a micron how much a piece of steel, like a grade beam, would move based on a temperature change. We can measure that. We can predict it with a micron. The variability of soils, clays, sands, silts, and their behavior ranges depending on how much water is in them and what kind of load is on them, how much of a force is on them, changes their behavior and how much they might move. So our job is to predict the unpredictable with very little data.
the movement of buildings is something that if you've ever been in a skyscraper when high winds, there
Yeah.
is movement, and
Oh yeah.
it's a little unsettling if I'm honest when you're way up there, but I know that it's designed to do that to a certain degree, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And
But that's
that's a
not
tolerance,
but the foundation is not moving, or is it?
right? So in that case, it's the structural elements, like the assemblage of the windows and the inner frame of the building. Um, it has some flexibility because if you build it uh, too stiff, it becomes brittle, or the shear forces become enormous. So having some flexibility in that building, um, a tolerance for movement is is structurally acceptable. Um, some buildings have moved a lot and not intended to be. Like I think the one of the most famous ones in North America is probably the Millennium Building in San Francisco, and in that case the foundations are moving, um, and it's well known. I mean, it's like every year there's a presentation on like where's the update, but the foundations are set in in the San Francisco Bay muds, and over time, I mean it to a much less extent. But the famous Tower of Pisa in Italy that's leaning, that's
Yeah.
a that's a textbook example of differential settlement. You know, you've got stiff soils on one side of the foundation, and you got really soft soils on the other side of the foundation. And over time, the building eccentrically tilts, and more load goes on the soft stuff, and more load goes on the soft stuff. As it tilts, it just increases the load and it increases the settlement. Um, there's that Millennium Building's been retrofitted, and we're continuing. The industry is continuing to study how that's going. The Tower of Pisa was actually retrofitted. They
Really?
wanted it to be a leaning tower. They could have corrected it and made it just the Tower of Pisa, but
The tourists
it's
aren't going to come to just see a building.
that's right. So the that's the fun part, is trying to figure out how much do we need to support this thing so that it doesn't continue to move, but that it stays tilting. You know, but yeah, you've got the gist of the I guess the scope right on the money.
What are some standout changes that you've seen in your career as far as the materials used, or a drastic shift in a design approach, or major, I guess, just we used to do it this way, we're doing a 180 as far as foundations go, or the depth, or whatever materials, there's high strength steel, there's concrete changes. Has there been anything that just pops out at you that's like, wow, that was a major shift, or hopefully an improvement
Yeah.
in what you do?
Well, there have been uh, continued developments in software, analytical packages, things that you would use to model like slope stability or groundwater movement. Um, the modeling side of my job has made leaps and bounds of changes that make the analytical work so much easier.
Hmm.
You think the a lot of the practice, the empirical information that was gained, the experience about how clays behave in tunnels, and how um, like what to do when this happens, or what to do when Y happens. Uh, the modeling software that's available to contain, like you can input so much information, like historic lidar, historic aerial photos back to the 30s, um, collections of all the boring data that you have from any related project in the area. You can and it's these some of these modeling software packages are better than your PlayStation 5, gaming capacity. That
Hmm.
the layers and the 3D views, you can pick up the model, spin it around, cut cross sections in ways that like the father geotechnical engineering could never have dreamed of. They had you know pencil and paper and had to draw representative cross sections,
Hmm.
and we can take this thing and run video cameras through hazard zones and look at what the like in model, within the model, measure deformation at specific like points of weakness, or and so with that modeling we've drastically, I guess it helps to have more data, but the potential to reduce risk to the owners
Yeah.
is amazing.
Is that I mean, has AI crept into that? It seems like it's working its way into just about every industry. Is is
Yeah,
that part of that modeling software AI, or is that still kind of on the fringes in your line of
it's
work?
so AI is not running the model. It's not producing the data that goes into it. It takes a drill rig operator and like a CDL driver.
Yeah,
It takes people to collect geotechnical data.
sure.
Um, and the processing of that data gets easier. Um, the some of the analysis, but I think the you know I actually our company is still, we're I would say, leading edge, or we're working on how as a company we want to use AI. And I think those conversations are ongoing, and it's been really interesting to listen to, you know some super senior people in the industry uh, are willing and ready to adapt and use these tools where it makes sense to.
Yeah,
Some of the chat GPT stuff, I watch these chess masters. They get chat GPT to play these chess matches, and it does like ridiculous things in the middle of the game, or and so we really, and I'll speak maybe globally to engineering practice in general, is that our number one duty is not to cause any harm. We
yeah.
have to consider our designs are going to hold up orphanages, and you know so we can't mess around with it. And so the testing and keeping up with changes and its abilities, and adapting it when it's safe to. But those conversations are happening, and that's pretty exciting.
You said the word globally just a second ago, and I'm not asking you to speak for, other countries, but when you get down to the nuts and bolts, are there a lot of differences in, say, your position in the United States and then someone, say, in Australia, or someone in, the United Kingdom, or pick a country in Africa? Do you all kind of, if you met with someone that was your counterpart in South Africa, assuming you spoke the same language, are you going to have a lot of similarities, or is it going to be like speaking a different language from a work standpoint?
um Man, so I think what you're asking about is what I would call the standard of care.
Yeah, that's a good way to put
And
it.
and in North America, I well, I should say, the United States and Canada
Right.
have really
I gotcha.
similar standards of care.
Okay.
Um, I'm not familiar with. Oh, so the other place that we get standard of care um, kind of bounds is um, like design manuals. So, like Federal Highway Administration or Army Corps of Engineers manuals that talk about, like, these are the steps, and here's how, these are established practices for
Okay.
these types of projects. In the private sector space, it's standard of care driven, right? So I would say that, like, designing a well in Africa might look a little different than the processes requiring permits and licensed well drillers, environmental controls, erosion and sedimentation, like all those things may not apply equally everywhere. It's still good practice, but there's local standards of care that may differ from northern North America.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that for sure. And it also depends on the, uh, I guess, if you're in the middle of the jungle in Brazil, they're going to have different building practices than St. Louis or New York City, or it's going to be night and day different.
Yeah.
So,
What I
but the
like about
scope of
it,
the
though,
project would be different as well.
yeah, and the physics doesn't change.
Right.
You know, Gravity and water are going to be your biggest enemies, um, anywhere you go. And the way, the materials you use or the way you solve it may change. But you know, it's in engineering practice. I would say there's in the, the physics, it's gravity and water. In your practice, it's your insurance company and your lawyers.
Well,
You know,
yeah.
but uh, that's why there's a standard of care. You know, you've got to perform within that acceptable range. There's no making it up in this industry. You don't wing it.
What would you say that you like most about your job? If there was one or two things that get you up out of bed every day.
Well, I think there's two. I really enjoy the solving of the problem. Once you solve the problem, it's kind of okay. Yep, we're on this treadmill for a little bit, and we got to we get through it. But the figuring out, when that light bulb comes off, all right, here's the solution. This is selecting that solution, finding that solution. That's really cool. Uh, the other part that I'm kind of mid career now, and the other part that I get an opportunity to do is finding the problems. So that's that's engaging with people uh, that whether they may not know they need my services. I can maybe connect them to people who can solve their immediate problem, but I'm enjoying the what I would call the business development side of things. So getting out in the community, learning um, who the movers and shakers are, engaging with municipalities and other like city engineers or state officials, planning boards, and responding to requests for qualifications. We have to demonstrate capacity and capability to do some of these really technical projects. And I think we're fortunate that we've got the resumes that we can win that work. And I'm enjoying bringing those kind of projects in.
You you mentioned when you first started that answer that you get to find the problems and then you get to look for a solution.
Yeah.
And I can see the satisfaction there is that it's not just, well, I just work on TPS reports all day long and I do that for 25, 30 years and then I'm done. Like you have a somewhat regularly fresh crop of problems to solve. And so you get to kind of, each project is different. So you get to stretch your creative juices a little bit and really dig into something that's not every day is different, but you're routinely having new challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. I I shouldn't have glossed over that. I can't I can probably count on one hand the number of projects that I have done twice. Uh like there's I'll tell you one. Like putting in a light standard. It's a really high light standard. Which is a pole like 200 feet in the air to illuminate these giant rail yards. So there's wind loads, and each light standard is a single drilled shaft. It's a single foundation. It requires one board. you know, there's not a lot of data, and it's a really simple field execution. It's a straightforward job. I've done two of those. like there's in what has it been 16, 18 years. No, even if it's the same, like a hotel, like generally the same thing, they're never in the same place. And so the ground conditions change. And yeah, so no two jobs are the same.
Is there a part of the country, and this may be too uh, oversimplified of a question to ask, but is there one part of the United States that is routinely in your line of work with the soil and the water and the ground and everything the most difficult to work in,
Hmm.
or one of two or three that are typically the most difficult to work in?
Yeah. Um, with I don't know. So from a hazard standpoint, The earthquake engineering is St. Louis is not. We're not in the center, but
Right.
we're pretty active
Yeah.
for seismic loading. There are places in western Kentucky and western Tennessee that are worse off for
Mhm.
potential seismic loading. Um, I wouldn't say those are like you just know that's the environment when you start designing there. Um, as far as difficulty, I think it comes more to do with what kind of construction it is. If it's like a tunnel in sands, is really that to me. I think that's pretty crazy
Yeah.
because sands are there's no cohesion at all, and if it's below the water table, it becomes a little bit more complex in the construction. But then you're dealing with contractors that have a lot of experience only doing that. And so in I think no matter what it is, and this is the best part, is we don't have to be as a geotech, we don't have to be specialized in such a small niche thing. Like I could probably design a bridge in in the Florida sands or in New Orleans mud or on Great Plains, Omaha. California's a little different because I don't have a California. They require a higher standard.
Of course they do.
They're
Yeah.
yeah, but as far as the geologic features, the background that I obtained through my course of study uh, equips me to deal with just about every landform and geographic feature there is. Now, there are people that will specialize in a certain area, and of course, in the consulting community, you learn who those people are pretty quickly, and for really complex projects, you need that level of skill. But man, I can't think of a place like I would not want to work there. I guess I'm not. It's not a fear thing, but um, tunnels are complicated. Highway jobs are complex because there's a lot of details, but it's a pavement section that's on top of a cut grade or a fill grade until you come to a bridge, and then those are really complicated. But there's nothing in that earth construction that you say, man, I wouldn't want to work there. I think, and that gives you that keeps doors open to go to a lot of different places.
Oh, sure. Well, it sounds like you enjoy the challenge as well.
Yeah, and I've got a well, to your point, I've got a Google Earth library, like a stack of sites with all the little pins all over everywhere I've ever worked. And it's, I was trying to think if there's, there's not too many places I haven't worked. Couple, three states in New England and Oregon. And I think I've
Hmm.
been everywhere else.
Well, that's kind of cool. I mean, you get to travel quite a bit.
Yeah.
What type of person does well in your line of work? Do you have a typical personality trait? Do you have a lot of introverts, extroverts? Obviously, you're going to be mechanically inclined, puzzle oriented, that kind of a thing. I think you have to be just to enjoy your line of work. But
Mhm.
is there a certain personality style that you see in a lot of your coworkers, or is it all over the map?
You know, that's like introvert, extrovert is probably nine introverts to every one extrovert.
That one
Um,
extrovert's probably really annoying to the group.
yeah, that's me. uh, so I'm trying to think, I think I think having that analytical interest and the tinker interest is got to be there. Um, you've got to have some level of this really needs to be perfect, and so I struggle with perfectionism because I don't think it's the right no that's the right term, but you have to be able to focus.
Yeah.
A lot of times throughout the day, I have to schedule work to big blocks of time that I know I can just kind of lock out everything else so that I can. complete a task, because if you get interrupted, you feel like you have to start over. Um, and so if that's a personality trait, I'm not sure, but it's there's a series of skills that can all be learned. And we started out, I talked about aptitude tests. Like that's
Yeah.
just really kind of a starting point. I don't think there's a single thing that I do that someone who's curious and who's interested, who has the work ethic, uh, couldn't learn also to do it. But that enjoyment part, I mean, that's got to come from the heart. You got to enjoy working,
Yeah. If you're not happy, it doesn't matter how good you are at it. You're going to be miserable.
right? Oh, and that goes for any job,
Sure.
you know.
Sure.
And so I, I'm constantly telling people like I'm, well, I don't know if it's constant. I'm passionate about what I do. You can't teach that,
Yeah.
but people can bring their own passion to whatever they apply themselves to.
Hmm.
And we kind of have a rule in our family. We're gonna be safe and we're gonna have fun. We're not doing those two things. Why are we doing it?
Yeah.
Uh, and so let's, like, when you're, I think about your listeners maybe out there trying to decide what they want to do with their careers or what they want to do selecting a career. That's it's finding that passion within yourself more than like expecting that passion to come from whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah.
Like if you can apply that fuel to anything, like what do you want it to be?
What is the best advice that you could give someone about how to deal with mistakes or failure?
Man, that's a great question. Because I think we all struggle with it. We So in my work, the I'll tell you first, the thing that bothers me the most is like when you when you turn in a a year end final, and like that's the end of the semester, that's your final report, or that's your final chemistry test. uh the semester's over. You earned the grade you earned. You're done. You're either going to repeat the class or you're going to the next one. We don't get to do that. uh as the project manager or as a technical lead on a project, I fill out, there's a number of calculation packages and technical writing documents I put together. And, I submit that and I'm ready to start working on the next one because I've solved the problem. I got the answers. Here they are. Here's your report. And that report's going to go through at least two sets of hands for a technical review and, maybe a legal review and a proofreading. And there's going to be edits to that. And I view, like, personally, I view those as, well, gosh, I failed here, or I didn't write what my project manager wanted to see, or, oh, I forgot about that thing that I was supposed to include. Um, and I had to, I had to, I say I struggle with this really early on. And it still kind of stings, but I get it a little better now. The maturity is improved. But that review and that feedback is the continuing education to be better next time. But it doesn't excuse you from completing it, from finishing it to 100% of polish. And it's a little bit like wet sanding. Like you've already been down to the 800 grit. Now we're going to 2000. Is this really? Yeah. Yeah, we are. We're going to make this thing perfect. And it takes that senior level review. And so I look at those, I'll call them failures for the sake of this question, but you look at those and say, okay, now this is better and I've learned something, and it took a little longer, but it's not the end of the world. The real failures in engineering are, like that bridge collapse in Florida University, Florida State, or when someone gets hurt on a construction site. Like
Yeah.
those kind of failures are far and away not something you ever want to be involved in, right? So you talk about failure. I think first of the my personal ones, but the reason that we're so stringent on the design documents and the reports that go out and the communications that go out is to avoid those kinds of failures that lead to loss of life.
Yeah.
That's in my mind unacceptable, and it happens every day.
Would you ever have a project? I mean, I would assume that no matter who you are, the person that's been doing it the longest, that's considered quote unquote the best in your line of work, would submit something that someone is going to find a change or an adjustment or a correction in. I just can't see a scenario where every hand that it goes through goes, nope, perfect.
Right. So what we're kind of talking about there now is a little bit of risk and contingency. So it is there some inherent risk to the project or this design? Yes or no. And the geotech report should detail what those unknowns are and what options are presented to mitigate them further. And then it can be the owner's decision how best to proceed now that they are informed.
Okay,
The
how much
the
risk are they going to tolerate?
right. The failure on our part is if we don't tell them.
I see.
And that's where in the design world you have a scope of work, and limitation there's limitations for that scope of work, and failures that may or may not occur outside that scope of work are not uh, not inherently our responsibility. If we're aware of them, we can discuss them and alert them. Hey, we are aware of this issue. You need to make sure that's checked, right? Or we're not moving forward until this issue is checked. And so there you have mechanisms, you have levers to pull to make sure those issues are addressed. Um, but to your point about construction, I think there's always, there may be changes that lead to a cost savings or a schedule savings or a cost overrun or a schedule overrun. And once you're in construction, the designs are all sealed, and the design work is done. Some of our services carry over into the construction side, and it becomes a negotiation. If it's an economic decision, um, hey, when we planned the work, we bid the work, we were going to do this task this way, and we figured out since we started that we could do it better if we do it this way. Can we have your permission to do it this way? Right? And it's just that's a negotiation or a conversation with the owner. Um, Sometimes it leads to a review from the design team to give their input or acknowledge this change is happening. Um, and after that, you're off to the races.
Hmm. The subject of pay is something that I do my best to address, but I always have to throw out the it just really depends on if you live in California, your salary, base salary or typical starting salary is going to be a lot higher than it would be here in Missouri just because the cost of living and everything is just so
Sure.
vastly different.
Yep.
But do you have any rough numbers in your head as far as if you go through the proper education and you're starting out as a geotechnical engineer, this is a ballpark salary that you should expect?
Yeah. I I mean, there's a lot of great places to kind of look up that information. It's also hard. Um, I'm tr- I could probably pull something up here real quick. We we as geotech engineers fall in a similar line of salary as a civil engineer,
Okay.
and when you start checking those boxes for the salary range, it doesn't get any smaller. tends to
Okay.
get bigger. So
Okay.
I think straight out of school, with a master's, different, and depending on where you are in the country, it could be mid 50s to mid 70s. And um, if you, I guess I mean, the sky is not the limit. I want to say some of the senior people that I know, principals, people with 30 years experience, people that are doing, uh, expert witness testimony on some of those failures we talked about. That's where their role is at a higher market, an hourly wage rate. They can be, in the 300,000 plus, and you know, yeah,
So
that's probably a
to
good
get your
range.
to get your foot in the door, the 50 to 70, with the understanding that with some time learning, paying your dues, getting some experience, the sky isn't the limit, but you can certainly do quite well financially.
Yeah, being in a profession, engineering, you've got a pretty good starting salary out the gate, and what you do with your career afterwards, if you join an employee owned company that invests in their employees and mentors, that it may be worth a little lower starting salary, because in a short amount of time you'll be vested with company stock that goes through the roof,
Yeah.
as the
Yeah.
company grows. And I know some people that have been with a firm for 10 years, and their returns for their shares and what their company growth rate is doing is worth more than their salary. So
Very nice.
so it's not just about the salary. There's a and and I would argue that I think the any candidates interested should look for the type of work that the firm they're interviewing with performs. If is it competitive, I'll say, uh, you know, bid and selection type work, where bottom dollar wins, or is it sought after expert firm that, um, has to say no to people because their backlog is too big and they couldn't address your problem. And certainly that, I think the trend, is towards companies becoming ESOPs or becoming employee owned, um, because of the compensation difference. I mean, they may not be able, from a cash flow stance, they may not be able to offer the top of the market salaries, but appropriate levels. But the growth opportunity within the firm, and within the equity of the firm, having equity in the firm as an engineer, is enormous. And so
It
there's
is it's tempting sometimes just to look at the salary as opposed to the benefits package.
That's
And
right.
there's a lot of times where you can get a lot more if you step back and look at all that you get versus just the dollar amount, like health insurance and stock options and all the stuff that you were mentioning.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there something that, if you could go back, and this is just a luxury conversation because we obviously can't go back in time, but is there another career that you kind of thought might be of interest to you, or was what you're doing kind of on your radar from pretty early, or that lane maybe you didn't even realize it yet? But
Uh, that's a man. That's a great question. Uh, so I don't know how good this mic is. If you can hear, there's a helicopter running outside.
oh, I've heard little
Um,
glimmers and stuff. Yeah.
yeah. So I was I'd considered, like, early on, uh, probably when I was like a little kid, being an airline pilot, and like paleontologist and police officer, firefighter, and I didn't I didn't explore that a whole lot. But I was a couple weeks ago, I was talking to this guy. He's Army vet, flew Hueys, for 30 years. And he's out here doing long line helicopter. And I said, "What's it take to do that?" He says, "Oh, 2,000 hours of helicopter time.
That's a lot.
And yeah, when you think about like the average instruction hour, dollars per hour is probably 550, like
Phew,
$550 an hour for instruction, and you can't get a real paying job or like a living wage job until you have almost 1,000 helicopter hours.
man.
Uh, yeah, so you probably want to buy a helicopter to get that kind of time, and not everybody's lining up to do that. Uh, I don't I don't I don't want to fly what he's flying, where he's flying it.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's why he's doing it, and I'm I'm not. There are some jobs that sound really cool. Um, you know, I thought about like finance, um, either like a finance consultant. My mom will tell you I should have been a lawyer. tend to tend to
I think a
argue
lot
with
of parents
everybody.
think their kids should get into law just
Yeah.
because of the arguing tendencies. But
Yeah. But yeah, um, I think the problem solving nature kind of led me down the engineering path. And I think if and I enjoy agriculture. I make wine and cheese at home, and if you can, I fiddle with all kinds of things that interest me. Um, and so that like, but to make a career of it, to make a living at it, would it satisfy me for that 40 to 60 hour week?
yeah.
I think I landed in the right spot, and then all
Well,
the other things can be hobbies.
yeah, that's the nice thing is you find that one thing that you're good at that pays the bills. And then the other things that, I enjoy building things from time to time, but if I had to do it to keep a roof over my head, I'd be homeless. So, it's nice to go, well, I'll do that and dabble in that for a little bit, but I'll keep my main gig.
Yeah, and I heard some really good advice, and I'll like the younger listeners. I don't know who you've got, but like that 17, 18-year old is really kind of lost and not sure what to do. Like they just got to get out there and do it, just whatever they're interested in, because
Yeah.
they've got an enormous amount of time that is like buffer time. You get to make mistakes. Um, this came from it was an American Airlines captain, and he was he said basically if you got a student who wants to be a pilot, and they just put their nose to the grindstone, and they find a way to pay for it to get that initial training, they can get through the process, all the ratings, get the hours, and start airlining, and be in that captain seat at 28 to 30 years old. And those guys, I mean, they're way above my salary range at 28.
Hmm.
So there's you don't chase a career for the money, but it supports the decision.
Sure.
I might be the best underwater basket weaver there ever was, but I'm not like I'm not going to keep a roof over my head.
Yeah.
But if I enjoy doing it, then my career supports that lifestyle.
Sure. Yeah, it's a means to an end. It can bring you joy when you have time. But
Yeah.
well, man, I really appreciate your time today. The whole geotechnical engineer that was one. I do firemen and police officers and pilots and all this stuff that you'd mentioned, doctors and everything. But this one came out of left field, and I thought that sounds really interesting. So I'm grateful for the time today that you took.
Yeah, happy to do it, happy to help and be involved. And I really I really like your approach and what you're trying to do. So
Thanks.
if you want to like shake my network and see what interesting things come out, let me know.
Oh
There's
yeah,
if
absolutely.
there's something else someone else you're looking to have your socks knocked off by.
You don't know Mike Rowe by chance, do you? I
I
keep
I
trying.
do. I do.
Oh, jeez. All right, when we're done here, we got to talk. We
No,
absolutely have to talk.
no, know of him. Can't get him to show up for my stuff either.
I know it. Well, he's a popular guy, so maybe someday he'll listen to one of my shows. But
Well, if you can come up with a fundraiser that'll put $50,000 towards his charity, he'll show up.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, I'm having trouble with all aspects of that. But well, thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. It was really enjoyable talking with you.
All right. Thanks again, Tim.
And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.